Welcome back. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and today we're going to talk about a compressor. But not just any old compressor, but an actual fully functioning super compressor. With the titanium RZE Resolute Super Compressor. Now, some of you are probably asking, what am I talking about here? What do I mean by fully functioning super compressor? And that requires story time. The original super compressors were prominent in the late 50s to early 70s. And what really separated them from the pack was an innovative spring-loaded caseback, which would compress as the water resistance against the watch increased, and the compression would actually reinforce its current seals and improve its overall water resistance. It was a pretty ingenious idea, and in that way it kind of reminds me of what Vostok did with their amphibias, where they created a design that works smarter, not necessarily harder. Now, as time went by, manufacturing technology improved, and it eventually became fairly easy to create a 200-meter diver without resorting to any of these creative solutions. So over time, the super compressors just died out. But people who love watches tend to love history, and over the last few years, there's been a major revival in compressor-style watches. And notice I said style, because these are watches that look like the old-school compressors, but they lack that spring-loaded caseback functionality. Yet there are a handful of purists out there, those who've gone the extra mile to create a fully functioning super compressor. And RZE has now joined them. Now, before we dive into this one quick thing to note that this is a prototype that was lent to the channel, and as such, all your standard prototype warnings apply. Although, I gotta say, this one actually looks pretty good for being lent around so much. In terms of size, RZE has followed the watch's namesake, the regular Resolute, which had a 40mm wide case and a 46mm lug-to-lug. The super compressor is also fairly thin. Their site reports it at being 12mm thick, but my calipers say 11.3, which may not sound that impressive for a dive watch, but compressor-style watches tend to be on the chunky side, and this is impressively thin for that. So that's one thing that's really important to note here. And just like every other watch from RZE, the case and bracelet are made from solid titanium, with an extra ultra-hex scratch-resistant coating added on. Which means this one's going to be fairly durable, as well as amazingly lightweight. On its bracelet, it's only 120 grams. Now, rounding out the specs, everything else here is fairly standard, which includes a Miyota 90S5 movement, flat sapphire with AR, dual screw-down crowns, and even though it only says 100 meters on the diver, this one will be a 200-meter diver at production. With that out of the way, let's move on to what I didn't like here, the bad so to speak. First off, I got a couple thoughts on the caseback. As you can see, it's a standard screw-down closed caseback, with a minimal amount of information on the outer edge. It's also pretty bare, and pretty utilitarian, which also translates into being pretty boring. Now, when you take in the rest of the watch with its very tooly bead-blasted finish, this is the caseback you would probably expect. But at this price point, something maybe a little more interesting would be nice, because that's what you're going to find with its competition. Which also brings up another point. Now, I know a lot of purists out there absolutely hate the idea of an exhibition caseback on a diver, as it's not really needed and typically adds a little bit of bulk. But as this is one of the few true super compressors out there, it'd actually be nice to see the watch's biggest strength. And this is what Christopher Ward did with theirs, because if you don't, it just looks like every other compressor style watch out there. Most of which are going to cost a lot less than this RZE, and that brings us to price. Currently, these are selling for $699, and that does include the bracelet, but that also makes this RZE's most expensive watch to date. In terms of value, this one's kind of tricky to talk about, because it really depends on what else you're looking at to compare it to. If you're looking at every compressor out there, both style and true functioning super compressors, then this one is on the high end. Now, there are some good reasons for that, namely its titanium build, and it's an actual true super compressor. But if you don't care about that, and you just like the way this watch looks, there's some stiff competition out there, which includes both the Notice Duality as well as the Mitch Mason Maelstrom. Both of those sell for $100 less, and they're both fantastic. Although the flip side to all of that is that if you look at just true super compressors, there are only 4 that I know of, and that does include this one. There's the Ferrer Aqua Compressor, which is $1,400 with a bracelet, the Christopher Ward C65 Super Compressor, which is $1,300 with a bracelet, which just happens to be the watch I'm wearing, as well as the Circular Super Sport at $730. So as you can see, out of those 4, this one is the lowest. But when you're talking value overall, it's really going to compare on if you actually care about that true super compressor functionality. Alright, so let's move on to the case design, and let me be clear here that this is a very minor critique, as I actually really like the case design. I mean, I liked it when I saw the original Resolute, and saw it on their Endeavor Diver, and RZE has continued to use that same basic design throughout. But here they have adapted it for the super compressor, by adding 2 small crowns on the right. Now, those crowns are a little hard to get a hold of, but overall it's not too bad. But the design itself is what I want to talk about. As a whole, it has a very distinct and unusual design. One that's complete with a simple bead blasted finish, giving the watch a straight, no-nonsense tool watch look, which was perfect for their previous watches, and is perfectly acceptable here. In fact, some prefer it. But at this price level, I think people are going to start to expect a little more, just in terms of the design and finish. And not having that puts this at a little bit of a disadvantage compared to some of its competition. Another thing is the rotor noise. In general, I'm a big fan of the Miyota 9000 series of movements, and I'm really glad to see RZE using it more over the standard Seiko NH35s. However, one of the few negatives to that movement is that the rotor noise is a little louder. How well that noise comes through greatly depends on the case the watch is in. Sometimes it's barely noticeable, and other times it comes through clearly. With this one, unfortunately, it's the later. In fact, it's one of the louder watches I've heard, and maybe you can hear it here. I'm not sure if it's the design, the case back, the titanium, or maybe it's just this specific individual movement. But whatever it is, from this watch right here, I gotta tell you, if you're sensitive to that rotor noise, this is one you want to avoid. And lastly, another warning to the overly OCD out there. And for this one, let's zoom in. If you're someone that's going to need this orange triangle in the bezel to perfectly line up with the 12 index, this one is going to drive you crazy. The bezel here, like most compressors, is a freely rotating bidirectional bezel, meaning there's no discrete stop at any particular point. And typically with these that have screw down crowns, when you push the crown in, it will disengage the bezel, allowing you to screw it in. But you have to be really precise when you do it, otherwise it's going to move just slightly before you can screw it down. And then it'll be off by maybe just a millimeter. For some, this is not going to be a big deal. I mean, it's just like any other Seiko out there. But if you're really OCD about this stuff, it's going to drive you nuts. And to be fair, this is a very common issue with compressor style watches. This is just how most of their bezels work. I've only run into a few that operate differently, with Christopher Ward being one of them. And to be clear here, I'm not calling out RZE on this. This is a very common issue, so I'm just pointing it out for everyone. Anyway, that was the bad. Let's now move on to the good, and there's quite a bit here I like. First up, the size. The Resolute is practically perfect for what I'd want this to be. And the shorter 46mm lug-to-lug makes this a great choice even if your wrist is a little slimmer. And especially when you pair it with the lightweight nature of titanium and the very thin profile of the watch, as this one is extremely comfortable on the wrist, and especially so with my 7¼ inch wrist. Doesn't matter if it's on a strap or a bracelet, this one simply melts once you put it on. The bracelet is also another great feature of the watch. It's a well-built, lightweight titanium bracelet with solid links, solid end links, and a good milled clasp. But I think its true strength lies in just how comfortable it is. The H-link design easily conforms to your wrist, and the extreme taper going from 20 to 16mm makes this one you can completely forget you're wearing. Let's move on to the dial, and this is where the Resolute really comes into its own. In keeping with the pure tool watch style they have forgone any semblance of a sunburst dial, opting more for a rugged matte sandpaper black, which may not sound exciting, but this one is still very eye-catching, as the pure white indices and orange highlights really pop against that black background. They not only grab your attention, but also make this watch highly functional, as everything here is coming through with a high contrast. It seems obvious that RZE designed this with functionality in mind, as well as a striking aesthetic, and overall, I think there's a good balance. The color scheme continues to the bezel, keeping a sense of cohesion even though the two elements are separated by a clear division, which keeps the overall design connected while keeping the watch face itself separated for easier reading. One interesting twist here is that RZE is only offering the Resolute with a 12-hour dual-time bezel. Now, this isn't the first time I've seen this on a compressor, but it's still a pretty unusual feature. While this might make the watch less useful if you actually want to dive with it, it does make it more of an ideal travel piece. Looking closer, the thin frame and luminous paint on the applied indices comes through brilliantly. Yet they aren't very tall, so there isn't a ton of depth here once you get past the bezel. And that might be my only real complaint with the design, but I think it is forgivable when you consider how thin it is. RZE also did a great job with some very vivid and distinct colorways, and that does include a fully loomed version. This Kevlar black right here is probably my favorite, but the fully loomed bezel in the sky blue is pretty cool. And unlike their recent Resolute version 2 release, and that's the Field Watch Resolute, not the Super Compressor Resolute. Remember what I was saying about confusion? Anyway, unlike that release, I do appreciate they have some standard black and blue colorways here. Well, sort of standard. The loom is also pretty good here, and that is typical for RZE. It's mostly bright blue with a few orange highlights, giving it some real character when the lights go out. Unfortunately, a lot of that is lost within the first few minutes. The orange components as well as the bezel quickly fade out. And again, that makes this not ideal for diving. But what is left does stay lit up for quite a while, even keeping up with my Seiko Turtle during the longevity test, which winds up making this one of the better compressors I've seen for loom, as they're typically not that great. And lastly, let's talk about what's just okay here, and this is where I talk about things that balance out with both good and bad, as well as points that may be more subjective. First up, the name. The Resolute Super Compressor is a good name. The Resolute was their first watch, and RZE fans should recognize it, as well as the case looks very much like that Resolute. However, the Resolute was actually a field watch. Their first diver was the Endeavor, and the Endeavor also had a similar case shape. And that brings up the question of why this isn't the Endeavor Super Compressor, but rather the Resolute. And again, that may cause a little bit of confusion in the long run. Now, we already talked about the overall design and that I like it, but there were a few things I didn't talk about before, such as the hands looking rather small as well as thin for a watch this size. And small is something you could also say about the dial. If you compare this to a standard diver of a similar size, I think this is going to be pretty apparent. And for some, this is going to be a big negative. But once again, this is also something that's very common with compressor watches. When it comes to compressor watches, there's only so much real estate under that crystal, and you gotta figure out a way to split it between the bezel and the dial. And just because of that, everything is gonna be a little smaller in comparison. In the past, I've seen a couple of watches that do a great job of creating a cohesive design between the dial and bezel, which makes the watch not feel quite as small. But in general, this is just something that's inherent with this type of watch. And lastly, we have the fact that it's a true super compressor, which may sound odd that I'm talking about it here because it is one of the major features of the watch. But the thing is, these days you don't actually need it. Originally, it was a creative solution to achieving increased depth ratings. But manufacturing technology today has advanced to the point that it's quite easy to make tighter tolerances with the standard design. Now, don't get me wrong, it's still very cool they went the extra mile to create a fully functioning super compressor. As far as I know, there are only 3 other watches out there that could say the same. And it's also nice that they did it in lightweight titanium. But the reality is that it doesn't give you any extra capabilities, and that's something you should be aware of. Looking back, I think I've nitpicked this one pretty hard, which is something I tend to do with their watches. I think it's just because Travis and the rest of the RZE folks do such a great job designing and making these, that they often go above and beyond what you typically see, and that does create a lot more to talk about. But bottom line, this is a great watch. Like a lot of RZEs, it's priced a little on the higher side, but still overall very reasonable. And that's because you really are getting a solid, well-made tool watch. This is easily one of the best compressors I've seen, and I've seen my fair share. And I'm not just talking about watches I've reviewed for the channel. I tend to like them and I tend to buy them. In fact, just right here, right now, off to the side of me, I have 2. New NTH I just bought, and I'm finally finishing a review on a Loom Tech. Then in a box just out of reach, I know there's another one in there, and back there in those watch boxes, there's at least 1, if not 2. So I've seen my fair share of compressors, and this is one of the best ones I've seen. I'm not exactly sure where I'd rank it, but it's definitely in the top 5, if not top 4. Although in terms of comfort, this may be the most comfortable one I've seen. From the very beginning, the very first Resolute, RZE's tagline has been assembled for adventure. And I think that's something they've stayed true to, just by creating some of the best lightweight pure tool watches around. Ones that are ready to go anywhere and do just about anything. And the spirit is something all of their watches share. It's just now with new models, they're coming in different flavors. Anyway, I think that's all I got for you today. As usual, let me know what you think about RZE's Resolute Super Compressor down below. And also let me know if you'd like a video just on all the super compressors I've seen. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time. See you next time.